Hello, welcome to Very IT. My name is Prabdeep Singh Mann. I'm the founder and lead instructor at Very IT. Now, in this session, we're going to be covering two main different topics. Firstly, we'll be running through the PowerShell array, and secondly, we'll be running through the For Each function in order to carry out looping. Now, throughout this session, we'll be covering a number of different labs so you can build your knowledge, skills, and experience. If you could do a great favor by hitting that like, subscribe, and hitting that bell notification, that'd be greatly appreciated. Many thanks. Here, we'll be looking at PowerShell Array. Okay, so before we move into the PowerShell arrays, let's just quickly recap what the variable was. So variables where we would assign a value statically to a value in what we've covered so far. Now the thing is, let's say for example you have a variable for apple, you assign it apple, a banana variable, you assign it banana, and a cherry variable and you assign it cherry. You can see there's quite a lot of different variables, and if you're talking about hundreds and thousands of them, it can become quite inefficient in terms of writing that PowerShell script. In Q, this is where an array comes in. So an array is essentially like a placeholder, but it has multiple items of the same types. Let's take a box of fruits, for example. If you had a box of fruits, that box is what we call the array, and all the values that are within it, they're all the same types of fruit. They're all the same type, i.e. a fruit, but they're different values. So we have, a fruit called apple, we've got a fruit called banana, and a fruit called cherry. They belong to the array because they're the same type, namely a fruit, but they're different values, namely the apple, banana, and cherry. So essentially what we're saying is that an array is where you can assign and create one big variable, loosely speaking, and those different types where we're segmenting it into the apple, the banana, the cherry, they're essentially segmented or indexed in that variable. So that way you can now say, well, okay, apple goes to person 1, banana goes to person 2, and cherry goes to person 3. So to solidify our understanding, we're just going to run through this practically so you can build on this. So the first thing we're going to do is how we would normally do it for a variable. We're just going to do a $, and we can call it an array, for example. Call it what you like, but we can just say array for now. And we're going to assign it an empty value. So we're going to say equals that, open bracket, close bracket. And when I highlight this, it's going to essentially store an empty value. So if we were to run that, nothing will turn up here. But essentially, it's assigning an empty value for that array. Now what we're going to do is just confirm that this is definitely an array that we've just created here. And what we can do is if we go to the $array again, and we're going to get type, press a tab on the IntelliSense, and we're going to just run this now. Highlight it, run selection, or press F8. And as you can see below, it does mention that the base type is a system array, so that just confirms we are dealing with an array here. This means that we can store multiple values of the same type within the array. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, the best way to do it is, let's say for instance we do $array equals $array, but we're going to assign, we always have a plus when we're looking at array. That's how you can distinguish we're dealing with an array here. And we're going to add the string, i.e. the text of, let's say we're going to pick, in our example, the apple, banana, and cherry. So if we assign the apple firstly and run this, you can see that it will, if we were to actually now look at array and see what it is, that will in turn provide the value of apple. And now let's say we want to repeat this again. This time we're going to just copy the above and just paste it just to save time. And let's say we're now going to put banana in this time. So if we're to run this, and now we look at the value of the array again in light of it. We've had apple previously. Now we've got the banana in there. It should produce a list of apple, banana in that same array of values. So if we would do this now, you can see, as expected, it's got the apple and the banana. Okay, let's also put one more in. Let's say it's a cherry as well. Alphabetical order. Keep a cherry. And now if we were to run this again, highlight run selection and check the value of the array, you can now see that that array stores 3 separate values in that single array. Now, if we were to do this in variables, we would end up having 3 variables for the 3 respective different values over here. Okay, so next bit is to now look at how we would go about indexing it. So for instance, we now know that, right, the array includes the apple, banana, and cherry. In that array, how do we go about just picking one of those within the array? Well, the best way to do it is you would essentially have these hard brackets with the numbers respectively to recall them. So the best way to do it is if we were to do $array and we go to hard bracket 0, then what you'll find is it doesn't count from 1, 2, 3, it counts from 0. So this is at the very bottom. Apple is position 0, banana is position 1, and cherry is position 2. So if we wanted to recover essentially the apple in the array, we would just simply put $array 0. So if we were to highlight that and run it, you can see as expected it recovers apple. Okay, let's repeat this, but we're going to put number 1 and number 2. So if we were to highlight this and then run it, you can see it's brought apple. If we look at number 1, we should expect to recover the value banana as expected. And then lastly, if we're looking at the position number, we're looking at the cherry, we look at array number 2, and as expected, it produces cherry as expected. So another thing we can do now is, let's say we were to create a string and combine that array in there. So let's say I do open bracket, I enjoy eating, and we're going to put in the array plus $array, and we were to do the hard bracket 0, so we can then recover apple for this scenario. We run this, you can see it does bring the output I enjoy eating apple, because it knows that's the array 0, which in the list is apple here. So let's repeat this again. So rather than me typing this out again and again, if we were to actually run the entire thing as it is, you'll see that it will bring I enjoy eating apple multiple times. However, as we know, each of those arrays have a respective position. So we're just going to put the 0, 1, and 2, which we know are going to be respectively the apple, banana, and cherry. So if we were to now run the entire selection here, you can see it does bring the values of, as on the bottom, I enjoy eating apple, I enjoy eating banana, and I enjoy eating cherry. Now this method does work, as you can see. However, it's not the most efficient way in terms of writing a script. And in the next lab, we'll just run through how you go about writing it in a bit more of an optimized way. Here, we'll be carrying out the PowerShell for each function in order to carry out looping. We'll be using the for each in order to carry out loops so that we can write the script a little bit more efficiently based on the previous lab. Now, in order to do so, what we're going to be doing is using the for each. So it's similar to like the if-else statement, but we'll just explain what we're going to be doing here. So the first thing that we'll need to do is essentially run the script for each. And now what we're going to say is that, again, you can assign any value here for the variable, but we're going to be using the dollar item in the array. So for each dollar item in the array, then we're going to have our, like the if else statement, the open curly bracket as well as the close curly bracket. And then what we're going to say is that my favorite fruit, and then what it is. So we're going to say, use our tab for the indentation like before. We're going to be saying my favorite fruit. And then we're going to close quotes and use our concatenation, naming the plus. Before we do that, let's just leave it as that and explain what's going on. So like before, if we were to look at our array from earlier, the previous lab, we can see that those values should be the apple, banana, and cherry, which was as per our previous lab before this video. And what we're going to do now is say that, well, it's going to look for each of those items in the array, namely the apple, the banana, and the cherry. And if it finds each of those values, it's going to provide a value of an output of my favorite fruit. So if we were to run this, you should get my favorite fruit 3 times. So if we were to highlight the text over here for each dollar item in the array, please, if it meets that condition that there is an item, provide a value of my favorite fruit, named the string. So we should get that 3 times given we've got 3 values here in the array. So if we were to do that, as expected, it does provide my favorite fruit, etc. Now, if we looked at before, we had to write the string plus the array with position 0, 1, and 2. However, with this one, the great thing now is it will dynamically update them. So if I were to now in turn, okay, let's add a bit of space here, and what we're going to do in its place is add the dollar item, which is going through the array position 0, 1, 2 until it reaches the entire list, top to bottom. That dollar item is the same as over here. So we're now going to say my favorite fruit is, and it should have the respective apple, banana, and cherry without us having to put the hard bracket 0, hard bracket 1, and 2 for the arrays. And that way it just saves it and makes it a bit more efficient. So if we were to highlight this text now and run selection, you should find, as expected, my favorite fruit is apple, my favorite fruit is banana, and my favorite fruit is cherry. It saves us having to refer to each individual array on an individual basis, put in the position 0, 1, and 2. And that's pretty much how you go about using the PowerShell array in a loop, essentially, where we're using the for each. So here we're going to be using the for each within a loop and using it in the array. So in this scenario, the background is where we're looking to obtain a list of all the local users on my device locally, and then confirming the status of it, namely, are they enabled or are they disabled? So what we're going to start off with is essentially run off with our basic script, which is get-local user. And if we were to highlight this, it will in turn bring a list of all the respective users under the column name, and it's enabled, or whether that's true or false boolean, and then the description is it disabled or enabled. So what we're going to do is create an array. So like before, we're going to do $, and instead of calling it array, we're going to call it local users. and we're going to make sure that's empty. So we're going to just say equals at and the open bracket and close bracket. On us doing that, we should find it's just essentially an empty value. If we were to highlight the local users and run a selection, I think they're essentially. And just to before we continue, we're going to assign the local users to get dash local user. So we've got local local users, and we're going to equal that to assign it to the get dash local user. So if we're to run that, and now let's go back to local users. This in turn will make sure that our array is assigned the value for the get dash local user. So now let's just confirm that we're definitely dealing with an array. So what we can do is go to the local users and go to get type with the open bracket, close bracket, and highlight that. And as you can see, yes, we are dealing with a system array as expected. So now what we want to do is we know that the position, we want to get the values or the index of those values within the actual array. So like before, what we're going to do is go to local users. Again, if we run this, this will bring every single local user, but we want to get each of the index, namely want to just bring administrators only, the default account only, the guest only, etc. So we're going to use the hard bracket 0, and as before, it doesn't count from the position 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It will essentially go from the number 0 as position 1. If we were to look at local user with a hard bracket 0, you'll see that it brings the value for administrator. Likewise, if I were to repeat this again for the other ones, I'm going to paste this in for speed things up. If I were to just highlight all that, and it will return essentially administrator because that's position 0. If I want to now get the other values in the get dash local user, this will now drill down within the array. So if I were to now repeat this, you can now see, as expected, it does bring those respective positions. So now what we're going to do is to essentially bring down we want to drill down the administrator within the array. So to do that bit, what we're going to say is $local user 0. Okay, we know it's definitely 0. If we were to repeat this once again, this in turn will bring the entire object here. But what we want to do is just within here, we want to bring the value for administrator. So to do that bit, we're going to say, right, it's going to look under the column name under row 0 and bring the value administrator. So we're going to be using dot and whatever the column name is, namely name. If we're to run this now, this will bring value administrator. Let's just double check that's the case. And yes, it does bring the value for administrator. Let's also repeat the same thing, but this time we're going to be using the third column, which is description. If we were to do this, paste that for speed, and it's going to replace that column. Instead of using name, we're going to be using description. If we were to run this now and do description, you can now see it's got disabled account as expected. So let's just confirm that we're dealing with, they look like piece of text, which would generally be a string. Let's just confirm that is the case. So if we were to now in turn go to local, type in $local users with a position 0, but this time around we're going to say get type, and we're going to have the open bracket and close bracket. If we were to run this selection, you can see in fact this is a sorry, apologies, dot name. Then we do dot get type. If we were to run this again, we can see, yes, we are in fact dealing with a string. So now what we can do is provide a output that we're looking to get, essentially outlining the fact that if we have a user, what is its status? So in order to do that, what we're going to say is open bracket, the, and the $local user here. So what we're saying is the $local user, and we're picking 0, namely the administrator. Dot name. So what we're saying is we want to pick the local user, position 0 under the name, so row 0 under the column name, namely administrator. It should bring the local user name 0. So local user 0 dot name. Then we're going to use the plus for concatenation and say that I'm going to add the string has there as the status, and we're now going to add $local user again, but this time round we're now going to replace it with description. Description. So if we were to now run this selection, you can see the administrator has a status disabled account. So if we were to look back up over here, we can see, yes, the administrator has the status disabled account. So let's repeat this now for the other ones. So we're going to say, copy this, paste that another 6 more times. 4, 5, 6, 7. Because we do have 7 respective local users here. And now what we're going to do is just change the index, namely the position that it finds the values in the array. So we're going to say that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. So if we're to highlight this entire text now, it should bring that the local local user, namely, and let's say we're picking number 2 now, or all the other ones, it will say the local user, wherever the name is, and has a status and what their respective position, what the respective descriptions are. So if we were to highlight the text, as expected, the administrator has a status disabled account, default account has status disabled account, etc. So it brings all the respective users as well as their status. So now what we can do is to write this a little bit more efficiently, because as you can see, it's quite lengthy in terms of us getting it to this stage. It can be written more efficiently by using the for each. Now what we're going to do for this bit is to use the $local user, and we're going to say like before equals get dash local user. And now what we're going to do is use a for each function. Like before, the for each, it's basically similar to the if else statement. However, it just uses a loop where it's going to identify all the respective items that we can then in turn input into a string of text within our selection statement. So let's just run through what that means in a bit more simple terms. So we're going to say for each, and we're going to have an open bracket $item. Now these, what we set here at the very beginning, you can call it whatever you like. Here I'm just going to call it $item in the local user. So let's just, before we continue, we're just going to see what the value of $local users is. As before, we know that it's essentially all these values over here. So it's saying the $local user, namely the array, we're going to be assigning the get dash local user. And for each of those items within here in local users, we're going to provide a output. So we're going to be using the open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and we're going to say, we're going to use the indentation like before, and we're going to have an open quote, and we're going to say that the user putting, we're saying the user, we're going to put space over here. We use a concatenation plus $item dot name. We're going to be picking each of those items in the above local users under the name, so the username plus, and we're going to concatenation, add a bit of space there as well. As the description, a bit of space there as well. And we're going to add $item again in each of the values of local user in the array. As this description. So what it's essentially doing is it's looking for, it knows that the local users array is all this over here. It's looking at each of those items within here, and in each of the items it's saying the user item, let's say the administrator for the column name, has a description, and it will look at the item again, each of these items in here, and look for the description. So this in turn should run through each of the items within that array. So it should generate 7 statements saying that the administrator has a description, disabled account, the user default account has a description, disabled account, etc., and run through the entire list without us having to type it in manually one by one above. So hopefully if we run this now, this, we know that, okay, we've got our array local users, and now we're going to say here, this, as expected, the user administrator has a description, disabled account, the user default account has a description, disabled account, and if we were to look above, yes, that is the case. And that's essentially how you would use the for each within a loop and a PowerShell array. So in this lab, we're going to be looking at using the for each as well as the if else. So it's a combination of the two. Now, the premise of this is that when we do, let's get the get dash local user command over here. What we want to say is that it will get a list of all the respective users, and it will decide if it's got a status of enable being false, then that account will have a description of it being disabled. However, if the enable status is showing as true, then the status of it will show as the description being enabled. So essentially, we're looking to make sure that the enable value and the descriptions should essentially match accordingly. So what we're going to do is to start the practically. So we're going to create an array. So we're going to be doing $local users, and what we're going to be saying is that that is equal to get dash local user, and then we're going to go to our for each, and it's similar to a if statement in its structure. So we're going to have if, like an if else, got the bracket on there, with this one's got for each, as before, and we're going to say for each, and we're going to pick a dollar item. Now the dollar item that you pick, you can call it whatever you like. I'm just calling it dollar item in this scenario here, so we understand which per item within the array. So we're going to do dollar item in array, which is local users. For each item, dollar item in local users. Now going to use our open curly bracket as well as close curly bracket. So within here, we're now going to use an if statement. So if, and we're saying the dollar item is going to be checking all these items here. We're going to be checking the enabled column. So we're going to put dot enabled. We're saying if any of those here are true, so equals dollar true, then we're going to have another open bracket, close bracket over here. So we're now going to have another indentation, and we're going to be updating the description. So we're going to say, well, within that column, we want you to set the local user, and we're going to search for its name under this column. So we're going to set the local user with its with a name under this column over here, and we're going to give it a description. And the description is going to be called account. And that will pretty much look at getting all the local users within here. It will find the actual name, these ones over here. So set local user within the values within this column over here, and give it description based on the static value enabled account, provided that the status is enabled as being true. Okay, now we're going to repeat this, but this time we're just going to modify it. I'm going to paste that, but we're going to change that to else if. Because with an if, you got an else if, we got else, depending on what you want to select. We'll pick else if. And we're saying if it is false this time, so we're looking at this column, is it false? Then what we'll need to do is update the description to being disabled account. That would essentially conclude that. So if we were to now highlight this here and run it, see if there's an invalid argument. Let's just see where we're at. Check. Apologies. Again. Okay, so now if we were to check our get dash local user, selection, what we should find is where initially had this is a disabled account, it should just update to disabled account. And also where this shows up as this is an enabled account, it should just update the description to enabled account. So let's just make sure that is the case. Where to run this now? As you can see, yes, the description has updated from this is a disabled account to disabled account, as well as this is a disabled account. Sorry, this is an enabled account to enabled account. And also we can just make sure that our variable has updated. So if we back to our $local user, run that one more time, then make sure that's updated because it would store it needs to be refreshed. So it should now update to the latest refreshed version over here. As expected, that has updated. Yeah, and that's pretty much a summary of how we go about updating the local users, whereby it will check the enable status. If it is true, then it updates the status as being an enabled account. If the enabled status is false, then it'll update the description to being disabled. And here we used the for each as well as if else statement. So hopefully you found today's session really useful. Just to summarize, we covered two main different topics. Firstly, we ran through the PowerShell array, and secondly, we ran through the for each function in order to carry out looping. Now, throughout this session, we covered a number of different practical hands-on labs so you can build upon your knowledge, skills, and experience. If you can do a great favor by liking, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, that would be greatly appreciated. Many thanks. Bye for now.